Welcome back to People, Power, Impact, the Future of Immigration, OCASI's biennial professional development conference. We've had a wonderful, wonderful start to a conference this morning with 3 dynamic ideas that ignite from young leaders in our sector. We also heard from Senator Kim Pate, who has been a great ally and is doing important work in terms of prison abolition, as well as lending her great support to causes such as ensuring citizenship for immigrant and refugee children in care, those who came in who are undocumented to find themselves criminalized and often face the prospect of deportation. So we are so glad that the conference has gotten off to a very successful start with some of our key issues already placed on the table. And thank you for all your comments as we were having our conversations this morning. A reminder that the conference is in both official language. We're simultaneously interpreting in both English and French. For those of you listening in French, if you are having problems with your audio, please send a private message to my colleague, Stephanie Brown, through your feed loop, private message to feed loop to Stephanie. Sorry, if you're having any audio program. If for those of you who were here this morning and you're joining us just now, at the bottom of your screen, there is a button on your right-hand side for interpretation. Click on that and you can choose the language of your choice to participate in the conference. For questions to panelists, please use your Q&A button. Panelists cannot see your chat, so if you have questions for your panelists, please use your Q&A button, which is in the bottom of your screen as well. Fighting for our future, countering racism, hate, and intolerance. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed stark socioeconomic inequalities in the country and disproportionate disadvantages along the lines of race, gender, and immigration status. We saw a rise in racism, hate, and intolerance, particularly anti-Indigenous, anti-Black, anti-Muslim, and anti-Asian racism. This plenary will feature a conversation with community leaders and organizers who are active in the fight against racism. Moderating our conversation this morning is my colleague and friend, Amira Elghawaby. Amira is a human rights advocate and journalist. She recently joined the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, where she is the Director of Programs and Outreach. Prior to that, Amira worked in Canada's labor movement in communications and human rights. She also previously spent 5 years promoting the civil liberties of Canadian Muslims at the National Council of Canadian Muslims between 2012 and 2017. Amira has an extensive career supporting initiatives to counter hate and to promote inclusion, including as a founding board member of the Canadian Anti-Hate Network and as a past board member at the Silk Road Institute. Her 2019 TEDx Ottawa talk was titled, "Multiculturalism, Worth Defending? Or is that worth defending?" She currently serves as a commissioner on the Public Policy Forum's Canadian Commission on Democratic Engagement and is a delegate of the 2022 Governor General's Canadian Leadership Conference. Amira is a contributing columnist for the Toronto Star and Press Progress. Amira, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Debbie, and congratulations to you and the entire OCASI team for convening this valuable conference, and to all the participants for taking the time to be here with us. So this plenary, Fighting for Our Future, Countering Racism, Hate, and Intolerance, what an important topic. I'm coming to you from Ottawa on the unceded and never surrendered Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory. I'm very much looking forward to our discussion this morning, and I hope that everyone will benefit from our panel of insightful and knowledgeable speakers. Now, as many of you know, hate crimes and hate incidents have become all too common across various communities in Canada, pointing to a troubling rise of intolerance and racism. We have seen an increase in anti-Asian racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-Black racism, and ongoing discrimination against First Nation, Métis, and Indigenous communities and other groups in our society. The rise of social media, divisive identity politics in Canada and around the world, as well as a subsequent rise in misinformation, has fomented hatred that continues to play out in dangerous, even deadly ways, as we have sadly seen this past summer with the tragic killing of several members of the Afzaal family. This worsening phenomenon is a direct threat to ideals of multiculturalism, equity, and inclusion that Canada aspires to, and is a growing concern for those of us who believe that every person in this country deserves to live with dignity and to seek their full potential. These trends mean that many immigrants, refugees, migrants, and other minority communities are having to face and experience deeply hurtful and frightening attitudes, systemic barriers, and racism. What does the immigrant and refugee serving sector make of all this? What responsibilities does it have? What lessons can we learn from those who've been confronting this for years? These are some of the questions we will do our best to address with our panel this morning, and we certainly welcome those of you in the audience to pose your own questions. Please drop them into the chat and into the Q&A, and we will be monitoring throughout. Now, let me introduce you to our panelists. Sarah Jama is Executive Director, Disability with Justice Network of Ontario. Many of you know her. Welcome, Sarah. Dr. Amal Madibbo is an Associate Professor in the Department of Social Justice, University of Toronto's Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. Thank you so much, Dr. Madibbo. Amy Go is President of the Chinese Canadian National Council for Social Justice. Welcome to Amy, and many of you know her as well. And Salma Toba is a community development worker at London Intercommunity Health Centre. So welcome to you, Salma. Now let's start with hearing from each of you briefly to describe how you see the issue of hate and racism and how it impacts your work and why the issue requires our collective action. So I'll start with Sarah.
Hi, thank you so much for having me here today. I'm super excited. I haven't really done a lot of panels in 2021, so I feel honored to be here. One of the first things I'll say is Hamilton has the largest density of disabled people in the province. So when we talk about hate and racism, I think about it from that perspective too. We know that people with disabilities in Canada have some of the highest rates of violence in their communities. Whether you're looking at hate crime or internet partner violence or sexual assault, 83% of women with disabilities in their lifetime are likely to be sexually assaulted at least once. So when you add race to the mix, you see a lot of people with disabilities who are funneled into the medical to prison industrial complex, or who continuously have trouble with facing violence at the hands of our education system and our criminal justice system and our healthcare system. So these intersections really do highlight the fact that disabled people, especially racialized disabled people, face the highest amounts of violence in our country. And so when I think about violence faced by disabled racialized people, I think about Solomon Fakiri. He was a Muslim man who was killed, beaten up in the Lindsay, Ontario jail by prison guards, when he should have actually been given access to medical supports, right? He ended up there because of a noise complaint. The same thing happened with Abdi Rahman Abdi, an autistic Somali man who, because of a noise complaint, ended up killed by police. And I'm thinking about Regis Paquette and so many others who were, Ijaz Chowdhury, so many other people who were killed in part due to their disability. We see this in the encampment crisis as well, where here in Hamilton, we have over 20 encampments that pop up around our city. And it's not a giant city in the downtown core. And a majority of these people are people with disabilities who have been listed by shelter systems as being too disruptive, because our shelter systems are not equipped to deal with people who need to use substances. It's not a safe space, but to ask people to go into our systems and change fundamentally how their bodies work is a form of ableism too. And so what we have is a lot of Indigenous, racialized people who are living in poverty in encampments who experience violence from neighboring residents. and from the systems themselves, where they're kicked out over and over and over again from shelters simply for existing. And we know that there's not a lot of data collection from Stats Canada around race and disability. It's very hard to find actual statistics. And so these are sort of the gaps that I'll mention off the bat that I'm noticing.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for those opening remarks, and already much to start to think about. Dr. Amal, if you could take the floor. You're on mute, Dr. Amal.
What?
There you are. Thank you so much. We can hear you now.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Merci à David Douglas et l'ensemble de OCASI d'organiser cette conférence cruciale qui met sur place des politiques canadiennes telles que la loi sur les langues officielles, la charte et la loi sur le multiculturalisme. Donc, Sarah Jama vient juste de souligner les identités multiples, un aspect qui s'applique également aux Noirs francophones au Canada. L'héritage de Mathieu d'Acosta nous apprend que les Noirs francophones font partie intégrante de la société de la nation canadienne. Il y a plusieurs générations de Noirs francophones, troisième génération et plus, deuxième génération, première génération, et ainsi de suite. De par notre race, nous, les Noirs francophones, subissons le racisme systémique anti-noir, à la fois dans l'ensemble de la société canadienne et au sein de la francophonie. De par notre langue, le français, nous faisons face à la discrimination linguistique qui favorise les anglophones au détriment des francophones. Des nouveaux arrivants et nouveaux immigrants noirs francophones ont recours aux services tels que le service d'établissement. D'autres ont recours aux services de santé. Ces services sont majoritairement disponibles en anglais et ceux qui sont offerts en français ne tiennent pas compte du racisme anti-noir. Par conséquent, des services ne sont pas adaptés au vécu des Noirs francophones. De plus, pendant que des Noirs francophones utilisent ces services, très peu occupent des positions clés d'offres de services. On s'attend à ce que les Noirs francophones établis parmi la troisième, deuxième ou première génération, par exemple, soient inclus dans ces positions clés, mais ce n'est pas le cas. Cette marginalisation renvoie au racisme anti-noir qui donne lieu à l'exclusion des Noirs francophones des positions clés au sein des institutions francophones et renvoie également à la marginalisation linguistique qui débouche sur la marginalisation du fait francophone. Toutefois, les identités multiples des Noirs francophones signalent également des stratégies de résilience que nos communautés développent afin de combattre le racisme anti-noir et la discrimination linguistique et améliorer les lois canadiennes telles que les lois que j'ai mentionnées afin de bâtir un meilleur avenir. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Dr. Amal. Amy, if you could take a few moments, please, to share with us.
Thank you so much. I'm very grateful to be speaking to you from the lands of the Misagas of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, as well as the Wendat. And we also recognize the enduring presence of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples in Toronto. Thank you very much. From January to October 2021, 152,000 hateful and racist tweets were recorded by U of T through a collaboration with CCN-CSJ, basically linking Chinese people and COVID-19. Dirty Chinese bring the virus, we eat everything, Chinese government intentionally spread this virus across the world, but primarily about Chinese and that we would to be blamed for COVID-19. And all these social media hate is also, of course, seen in, unfortunately, the physical attacks that Chinese Canadians and East Asian Canadians experienced throughout the pandemic. From February 2020 to March 2021, 11 and 50 1,150 incidents were reported by COVID Racism and Eliminate Hate Race websites hosted in Toronto and Vancouver. These incidents ranged from taunting all the way to physical assault. 60% of the victims were women, including my own family. My brother, who is a senior in his 70s, was almost hit by somebody throwing object at him on the street. And my sister, now Madame Justice A.V. Go, also got spat at, almost got spat at on the way to work. So the pandemic has really highlighted the perception of yellow peril, which is a term that was referred to Chinese and Japanese Canadians in the 1800s throughout the early history of Canada. And this term actually, it's not just referring to that Chinatowns or Japantowns were dirty and disease virus ridden and bringing diseases to the communities. More importantly, the term was that these yellow races would taint the pure white Aryan race. And so the pandemic really amplified and exacerbated this entrenched, racist perception of yellow peril. At the same time, the pandemic really highlighted the perception of Chinese being forever foreigners. We were told over and over and over again to go back to China. Generations later, being Canada, we're still being told to go back to China. And so essentially, Chinese Canadians just don't belong here, and our loyalty is always questioned. So, and it's also this pandemic that highlighted to Chinese and East Asian Canadians that have been subjected to this model minority myth that started in the States through the civil rights movement, pitting Black Americans and against Japanese and Chinese Americans. The pandemic showed to us that model minority myth is a racist divide and conquer tool, and it's also a tool of oppression designed to keep Chinese and East Asians in our place, to stay silent and not to challenge. And so what has the Canadian government done to stem the tide of rising anti-Asian racism? After months of lobbying, finally, a definition of anti-Asian racism was included in the National Anti-Racism Strategy. And OCASI, CASA, and many of our colleagues actually worked very hard to fight for this definition being included, and actually worked on that draft and the final definition that now appeared in this anti-racism strategy. Then we had, right before the election, the government announced the budget. And what the budget says was that, okay, we're going to throw you a bone of $11 million to fight against anti-Asian racism through a national coalition. So what does that mean? It means to us, Chinese and East Asian Canadians that have been subjected to all these rising tide of racist attacks, that you are one group. You are not, you are one homogeneous group. You better work together. You only deserve this amount of money, and you can only work under one group, and the government will only deal with you through one group to fight racism. This announcement totally and again perpetuates this minority being the same, being homogeneous, and minorities, you only deserve this small attention and resources. And again, this whole attention and this anti-racist, anti-Asian racism being mentioned once in the budget, again, perpetuates that there's no recognition of systemic racism. There's no recognition of the need to structurally reform and review how we operate in Canada throughout government departments, as well as our policies and all our laws. So here we are today. Unfortunately, we still have a long way to go.
Thank you so much, Amy. Over to you, Salma.
Thank you, Amira, and thank you, OCASI, for having me this morning. I join you from London, Ontario, which is significant considering our topic this morning. As Amira mentioned, just 4.5 short months ago, 4 members of the Afzal family were killed in an Islamophobic hate crime. As I was preparing for my marks this morning, I think I was at a loss for words almost, what I could say that would communicate how people have been feeling here, specifically in the Muslim community. And I think in addition to the overwhelming sadness and anger and grief, I think there's a sense of confusion, really. Confusion as to how it feels like the world hasn't come to a complete standstill after these events that have transpired, that we've seemingly gone back to our lives as they were before. That's to say those outside of the Muslim community have gone back to normal, because those of us who are Muslim, and especially visibly so, I don't think anything will ever really be the same again. And I think it's this unfortunate reality that is shared by so many and too many communities across Canada who have been affected by colossal loss time and time again as a result of living in a white supremacist society that endangers us for merely existing. I can share, anecdotal evidence currently from the lives of Muslims, but I also wanted to bring forward a study that was conducted just this past summer from Berkeley and Stanford, where they surveyed a number of Muslim communities across the United States and Canada. And what they found was that over 80% of respondents reported that they felt that Islamophobia was not being taken seriously by civil, corporate, or political leadership. And that nearly 80% of respondents felt that scared and insecure about their safety and their future. And 52% had experienced a hate crime just in the last 12 months. So during a pandemic, during lockdown, when we're not seeing each other as often, when we're mostly in our homes, half of respondents still had experienced a hate crime. I report these numbers because what I feel like is most often missing from the conversation is just an understanding of the magnitude of the problem. Which is important because before we can fully address an issue, we thoroughly have to understand and define it. And if we don't have an understanding of the full phenomenon of racism and how it's experienced, then how can we address it? And I would argue that I don't think there is a full social consciousness outside of racialized communities as to what it is to navigate in predominantly white societies. So the first step for me, at least, I think, is having these conversations and really understanding the experiences of those in racialized communities and how this intolerance, this hate affects us, and at the end of the day is very lethal, as we saw just this past summer. And by amplifying these experiences, that's how we can begin to understand and address the issue at hand.
Thank you so much, Salma, for those reflections. Thanks to each of the panelists. So now we're going to get into the questions, and I'm already seeing people popping in their own questions into the Q&A, so please keep this coming. And if you have a specific question for a specific panelist, make sure to make that clear as well. But let's get into the discussion with a little bit more detail. So Sarah, I'm going to come back to you if I may. Now you talked about the multiple identities that people hold and how they're going to experience discrimination in different ways. What is sometimes missing from how people receive support for the hate or discrimination that they may be experiencing?
So just from what I see in terms of interacting with people who have experienced ableism or racism or both, we often miss conversations around class and talking about root causes. A lot of us are trained to talk about how people feel. But when you're thinking about a disabled person who is experiencing a hate crime in an educational institution or medical institution or through our justice system, it's not enough to just talk about your feelings. There isn't enough support for disabled people across the board in these systems. And so we have to also look at who often gets the chance to speak about these issues and whose voices do we constantly kind of ignore. When I think about disability justice in Canada, it's usually centered around whiteness. So I'm thinking of like the David Lepofskys and all the disabled white men who get the chance to speak about oppression, but you never really hear from Black disabled people who've experienced carcerality. or who've experienced accessing food banks, right? The loudest I've ever seen disabled people living in poverty was just in the beginning of the pandemic on Twitter, where people were literally saying, if I don't have access to food or shelter, I'm going to use medical assistance in dying as a way out because that's my only option. Right. And what we had in response to that was the government choosing to expand legislation, because the voices that were centered when you're talking about like the depths of poverty and classism were actually white people with wealth who were saying, we want the choice to be able to die. Right. But we don't really hear from the people who don't have those choices. And so when you're listening to people talk about, you know, homelessness or racism, we don't really center those who are experiencing it the worst. We center the voices of those who can get up on a mic or a podium or speak on panels to talk about these situations, including myself, right? And so I think that's something that we need to move away from, centering the voices of those who normally speak on these issues, and we need to move toward looking at root causes. So, for example, in our medical systems, right, doctors actually don't get trained around bodily autonomy and accessibility or anything to do with disability. It's not actually part of their curriculum to understand the lives of people who are living with disabilities. So it's no surprise then that in our country, we put more funding toward childhood, right, instead of the adult lives of people who are experiencing, you know, medical racism in these systems. Or when you're thinking about like our carceral systems, what are the ways in which disabled people are given bodily autonomy as they're trying to advocate for their rights? And why is it that so many people in our jails have disabilities and are not being given actual supports? Something as simple as ASL interpretation doesn't exist in our prison systems or our hospitals, right? And so we have a long way to go when we're talking about hate crimes. And as much as we talk about hate crimes on an individual basis, I still look at it structurally. I still think that the lack of ASL interpretation or the lack of supports in our systems is a form of hate crime as well. Or the fact that we prioritize medical assistance in dying before we actually give people money for food, shelter, and housing. So for me, that's a form of hate crime as well. We need to be talking about systemic root causes and away from just the interpersonalization and the feelings around what it means to be experiencing hate in our communities. Because if we don't, we're not really going to get to the root causes.
Reminder to the panelists to slow down when you speak for interpretation purposes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for a lot of really important points. Particularly, I think when we're talking about hate, we do indeed often think about it sort of as an individual to individual and fail to really look at it more systemically and holistically. So your points are really well taken. I'll ask the next question to Dr. Amal in French. Dr. Amal, en matière d'intersectionnalité, pouvez-vous nous expliquer comment le racisme affecte les Noirs dont la langue maternelle est le français?
You're muted.
So yeah, sorry for that. Well, it's facing racism, you know, at two levels: at the level of the Canadian society, and also at the within the Francophonie. You know, they are Black Francophones have been in Canada for a long time, and the community is diverse, very diverse. You know, in line with what Amigo has mentioned, first, second generation, third, and plus. Nevertheless, we are still considered newcomers, eternally foreign. Those, for example, who use settlement services, there are fewer services in French than in English, and B, the services that are in French are not adapted to the lived experiences of the Black Francophones. Black Francophones are, you know, we face a dilemma whereby we receive services, but we do not offer services. We do not offer services due again to the anti-Black racism at the two levels, societal levels. Consequently, Black Francophones, regardless of the generation they belong to, are excluded from the key positions, such as key decision-making positions, such as offering services. Again, this goes back to systemic anti-Black racism and discrimination against the Francophones. The Francophone institutions, whether they are social service institutions or other institutions, such as the educational institutions, universities, you name it, are claimed, as a part in the name of all Francophones, then including Black Francophones who contribute significantly and actively to the minority Francophone struggle for these resources and institutions, which are approved and supported by Canada's official language bilingualism law. Yet when the resources and institutions are gained, and they are gained, the Black Francophones are excluded within these institutions, and at the same time excluded from Anglophone, general Canadian Anglophone, broader Canadian Anglophone institutions in terms of employment, education, and so on. So the intersection of being Black and Francophone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Amal. Amy, you talked about you talked about Asian Canadian communities having experienced systemic racism for decades, but we have indeed seen a shift during this pandemic in terms of some, as you mentioned, some recognition. How would you describe how folks within Asian Canadian communities are feeling right now about the way that this type of racism and discrimination has been taking some prominence in a national discourse?
So I think it's been a very painful time for us. I had the privilege of speaking to newcomers, parents, children, seniors. Many of them are immigrants in Mandarin, in Cantonese, and in English, and also professionals, multiple generations, born in Canada, fourth generation, as well as newcomers themselves. The general feeling is that the whole pandemic has been a triggering event. And I've noticed one of the questions posed was the mental health. It has been a triggering event because all these racist incidents not only made us be fearful, be afraid, be anxious of going out and live our daily life, concerned about our loved one, our parents, and our children. But more importantly, it's triggering because of the past trauma of racism that we have experienced since childhood. Many of them, bullying in school, had to change school because of bullying, not just for themselves, but also for their children. And many of them talked about their own workplace experience. I remember a childcare worker, first job in Canada, put up with 5 years of racist bullying, but that was her first job. She had no choice. She needed to build her credential, her Canadian experience, and to pay bills. So it's been such a traumatizing time for us throughout this pandemic. It's that painful triggering and that toll on our mental health. At the same time, though, I also witnessed that resilience and consistent resistance and fighting back spirit, and I was very heartened by young people coming forward, including my own niece, who is a physician who was not interested in social justice, but because of pandemic, what she witnessed in the hospital, treating COVID patient, calling her China virus, witnessing the white privileges and white supremacy in healthcare system and its impact on racialized communities, the higher incidence of infection and death toll and all that. Her now turn into somebody who wanting to do more and wanting to fight back. So I think, all these, there's always these, there's always, of course, the trauma, but also that resistance. And that has been throughout our history too, isn't it, right? Community groups have been fighting back throughout. And of course, it's still a long journey for us. It's, as I said, the government, it's like, this tokenistic gesture. So that, and then still we need so much more in collaboration and partnership and fighting back. But at the same time, I am, while I've been so traumatized myself and so anxious myself, that I am heartened and encouraged and motivated by those positive as well as energizing voices from our communities across.
No, thank you so much, Amy. And certainly that idea of resilience and building
Yes.
that internal resilience is one that I think would resonate across our panelists. And maybe I'll turn to you, Salma. I know that you've been talking and thinking about that type of internal resilience building within Muslim communities. Can you describe to us, what are some of the challenges, though, of doing that type of work?
I think I would have to echo the comments of my co-panelists, as they so well articulated in talking specifically about mental health and wellness. And I think part of the challenges that we've encountered, especially in the aftermath and the hate crime in London, is really around the accessibility and the availability of the mental health services that we need. And I mean that in the sense of people are, quite frankly, unaware as to how to access the mental services, not only in times of crisis, but also in terms of, the services that are preventative and help maintain a good health and wellness. And this is true for people who have been around for a long time, let alone people who are newcomers and people who have recently arrived. I think the second thing that is necessary to mention when we talk about accessibility is really the cost, which is truly prohibitive when it comes to mental health and wellness. And further disadvantages those who are lower income, who we know are more likely to be racialized and new immigrants. So it's really the situation where our communities are facing these barriers in terms of system navigation and cost. What we're also missing is the availability of service providers, social workers, psychotherapists, et cetera, who can provide a trauma-informed mental health services for racialized groups. We're missing racialized therapists, basically, Black, Asian, disabled, Indigenous in general, who can fully understand the weight of the trauma of living in a white supremacist society and the impact on our overall mental health and well-being in terms of the added stress and anxiety, as Amy was just talking about. So what we need is for organizations to be hiring racialized health professionals. And the question really that I really keep coming up against when we talk about resiliency and the challenges to it is, how do we heal and build resiliency when we are in a constant state of mourning, when we are in a constant state of anticipating the next bad thing to happen? How do we heal when we're still carrying the weight of pain and anger? Where do we put it? What do we do with it? And when I think about healing and resiliency, when how do we do it when the violence is constant and unyielding and increasingly lethal, as we've seen? And the violence here isn't just this interpersonal violence that we've been witnessing, but also the systemic violence that so many of us experience on a regular and daily basis. And the systemic violence, I would include living in a society that constantly traumatizes us and then puts up accessibility barriers to accessing the resources that we need to facilitate our healing. The last comment I'll make about this is just, I've seen this notion coming from a lot of different people from many different communities and saying about resiliency that the ideal would be for us not to have to be resilient, that I would much rather live in a society that wasn't racist and xenophobic and Islamophobic than be resilient because of it. That's really the ideal. And so I think, to me, the answer to building resiliency is in dismantling the systems of oppression that have required us to be so that we no longer have to be.
Thank you so much, Selma. And indeed, the question of mental health came to us from one of our participants, Kimberly Kurt, who, wanted to understand, what is the impact that it has for immigrants and refugees and how we can combat that. So both you, Selma and Amy, have provided some insights into that. I wonder if Dr. Amal and Sarah would like to also weigh in on the mental health impacts of discrimination, of racism on the people that they work with. Dr. Amal, for you first.
Definitely the impacts, are similar to what my colleagues have stated, on the community members, or my community members, as again, due to the multiple marginalization. I mentioned marginalization due to race and language, and also other identity factors such as religion, and religion in this case Islam, in line again with what the panelists have stated. They are Black Francophones who are Muslim, but this identity is, or the identity of this community and the community itself is invisible. So they suffer invisibility, as Black because of their language, French, and also because of religion. So I have, I encountered community members who, are either visible or invisible, and not in a positive way. Visible when they are racialized, due to Islamophobia, and so racialized Islamophobia, or invisible, they are not acknowledged and identified as Muslims. So then there is here a barrier in terms of access to community resources. So these multiple, of course, the impact of multiple identity, minority identities has, of course, its toll on the mental health. The community, the resiliency of the community, and powerful agency, within, for instance, the immigrant Francophone communities, fights this, counters this multiple discrimination and its impacts on mental health, and also, draws on scarce community resources to help and assist people who suffer, those of us who suffer these problems. Then this leads me also to stress what also my colleagues have stated, which is the need for coalition building. On one hand, the fact that we are lumped together into one category of Blacks is a double-edged sword, right? It prevents coalition building on the coalition building, but we should reverse the colonial gaze and use it to enhance, acknowledge the diversity within our community, and perceive this diversity as an asset to strengthen our coalition building within Black communities and with our allies to ensure a brighter future.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Amal. Sarah, did you want to weigh in on the issue of mental health? I know that you did open up your remarks mentioning individuals like Suleiman Fikiri, Abdurrahman Abdi, individuals who were actually killed by the very systems that were meant to supposedly support them and protect them, and that they had mental health issues and were not provided the supports they needed. Do you want to add to that and those reflections, Sarah?
Yeah, I think in response to some of what's been said so far too, one thing I'll just quickly add is, it's one thing to say that people don't know about resources available, but I think about how a lot of immigrants, there has been fear mongering for a lot of immigrants who come here, who are told that you have to meet certain health checks in order to even be allowed into the country. It wasn't until, I might be getting this wrong, but I think 2017, that Minister Ahmed Hussein at the time actually allowed disabled people to come in to the country as economic migrants, right? And so there is this perpetual fear about accessing resources around mental health, about not being seen as productive enough, about your workplaces not understanding. That's like ingrained in our families intergenerationally. That makes it difficult to talk about mental health at all. I can only speak from the perspective of being Somali, but it's people know that mental health is an issue, but it's another thing to feel comfortable accessing the supports that you know are there without being penalized or criminalized or facing some sort of punishment, right? And so even with physical disabilities, it's to the extreme that we have families who don't want to acknowledge physical disabilities in their kids, because what does that mean for their ability to be in the country, right? It's the fear around mental health that is embedded into the immigration process or disability is so nefarious that it has impacted us for generations. And so, yeah, I think more people than we know understand the resources that are there, but it's going to take a lot longer to unpack that fear in order to get people to access it and talk about it openly. So that's one thing I would say. In terms of like the criminalization that people with disabilities face at the hands of like law enforcement or police, it's a problem when the only places that we know to tell people to call are Coast, right? Coast, who comes with police whenever someone's in crisis. And so you'll have a complete imbalance of power where you'll have someone who needs support. Like I'm thinking of DeAndre Campbell. He actually called like, he actually called the police himself. He had schizophrenia. It was routine for him to call the hospital and police himself whenever he needed support. But the reason that he was killed was because a rookie cop was on site at the time he was killed and was scared of him, right? Had they looked at the file, had they really understood that this was routine for him and he knew when to ask for help, he wouldn't have been killed in his own home where his mom lives. And so we have a lot of work to do before we even talk about like the individualized like hate that exists, to really unpack why it is that people in our communities are killed simply for being disabled. And I think it goes back to like the history of colonialism. I'm thinking of like drapetomania, right? That one disability that was falsely created to name runaway slaves as being out of their minds in order to say that they needed mental health intervention, or the fact that civil rights leaders were disproportionately labeled as having schizophrenia, right? This ableism has always been a tool of the state to suppress certain populations that our society don't feel have the right to exist. And that's why over and over again, it's hard to engage with this topic, because in our minds, we think, oh, we don't want to believe that disabled people are experiencing some of the worst forms of hatred in our country. But it is a necessary tool. Ableism is a necessary tool of the state to make sure that people who are not able to be productive or useful to society are pushed out to the margins or erased. And that's the only way that I can describe why it is that someone who routinely calls police for his own support ends up dead in his own home over and over and over again. And add in the fact that we don't have proper data collection around any of these topics. You know, we had so much people in uproar talking about, you know, race-based data collection around COVID. I want to know how many disabled people are being killed by police. I want to know how many disabled people are in our prison systems. This data doesn't fully exist. In our prison systems who are racialized, right? And so we can't fully address any of this stuff, let alone access to mental health, before we even really understand the full scope of the problem. Sorry, I went on a rant there.
No, it's really brilliant, Sarah. Thank you so much. And it always amazes me how we don't have that type of data, you know, especially where we are constantly told that, you know, show us the data, prove to us the problem that you describe. And yet when we say, well, okay, well, help us, provide us the tools that we need to do that, you know, it's radio silence. So it's a really important point around the data. Amy, I see that you would like to weigh in on this. So please share with us what are the thoughts coming to your mind right now?
Reminder again to slow down, please.
I would like to share an experience recently with CCNC concerning hate crime and mental health. we were approached by a Crown attorney 2 days before sentencing and would like us to intervene to submit a community impact statement about a hate crime. It was perpetrated by a white person against actually multiple, and quite a few of them were Asian Canadian women. So CCNC, of course, we thought, oh, this is an opportunity for us to talk about the impact of hate crimes, not only on individuals, but on the communities. I have to say, I apologize fully that I did not do the due diligence of finding out more about the perpetrator and about the crime. We only knew that these were assaults and took place in public places in Toronto, and it was a white perpetrator. So our young, volunteer who's been a lawyer, was very eager and spent a whole day drafting that impact statement. We used the nipple tipping case from, drafted by A.V. Go from the clinic, as well as actually there is the OCASI statement that we also learned from. And on Friday, which was the sentencing, we knew, then we found out the perpetrator actually has mental health issues. After I learned that, I was just very angry, I was embarrassed, and I felt very, very guilt-ridden. If we had known that the perpetrator has mental health needs, we would not have intervened. We would not have intervened in that way. We would have intervened and asking for support of the perpetrator, And so how we found out was that the judge actually recognition of his mental health, in fact, reduced the sentence recommended by the Crown from 12 months to 10 months. And my is like, why was this person even incarcerated? What would that do to him? How would that help him, address his mental health needs in the prison system? How would that help the society? How would that help us collectively to have somebody with mental health incarcerated, regardless of the crime? And I was actually very embarrassed. And now here it is. This is, sort of like this hate crime and mental health issue. And I went, my goodness, our criminal justice system, as the panelists are saying here, Sarah in particular saying, had absolutely no understanding of, first of all, racism, hate crimes, as well as the ableism and entrenched oppression against people who are disabled, against people who are racialized. I was just very upset. And I wanted to share this with all of us because sometimes we are caught in this, sometimes, and we really need to take that system approach, that intersectionality lens to everything that we do. We cannot take anything just as face value, and especially when we are encountering with a system that the criminal justice and the other governmental system that has no perception and no understanding of what we are, our values and our principles. They were so disrespectful that they gave us 2 days and to ask us to talk about hate crimes. At the same time, they were so disrespectful to, in fact, every communities who are disabled, particularly those with mental health, that they think that this case can be used as a deterrent. And I was like, I just wanted to share this to vent, but at the same time is a warning, is a lesson learned for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Amy. it really does absolutely make us all wonder, because oftentimes when we talk specifically about hate crimes, we are often saying, well, we need to hold perpetrators to account. We need to make sure that police are doing their job, but we often don't think of that flip side. The perpetrators involved, when there is a mental health issue, are they getting support? Is there any alternatives to jail time, to prison? And that's not even a conversation that I've heard actually brought forward too often. So I think that also would make us pause to think about, how do we discuss these types of issues within our communities to address them in a way that doesn't reinforce the very structures that have been oppressive. Dr. Amal, you wanted to also add some thoughts in this very enriching discussion.
Yeah, yes, briefly, thanks. I agree that, of course, data should be gathered, and that some data can actually not be gathered, or at least not easily. And this is because that hatred is can be implicit, but it can also be, and unfortunately, possibly increasingly implicit, and it's not easy to identify, therefore it is not easy to report. Even when cases of hatred can be reported and identified as such. In the case of the community I work with, because of the invisibility I reiterated, and when I speak to the invisibility of the Black Francophones, of course, I also have in mind their powerful agency. But I'm familiar with cases of Black Francophones who've encountered anti-Black racism, especially youth, especially racial profiling, which of course both adds mental stress and reduces their sense of belongingness to Canadian society. And even when these cases are reported, they are reported as racism that Blacks have encountered, and not as Black Francophones, again undermining the diversity within the Black community. So on one hand, the data is collected, but it is not gathered properly. And again, other data is not easy to gather. For instance, no discrimination that, or at least not many, that Black Francophones encounter because they are Black Francophones and Muslim make the news, right? So point is, yes, we should gather data, but find more ways, better ways to uncover these hidden intersections of oppression. Thank you.
No, thank you so much, Dr. Amal. When it comes to data, for example, we know there isn't intersectionality. Even if we're looking at police reported hate crimes, we know that if you, for instance, are a Black French Muslim reporting a hate crime, police can only check mark one box for you. You're either Black or Muslim, you have to choose. Sarah, you also wanted to weigh in.
Yeah, I just wanted to, this might be a spicy take, but I also think when we're talking about centering mental health of the perpetrators, that actually does happen. It happens for white people. It happens for white people who go up and they shoot movie theaters. The media jumps on it and says, well, they have mental health concerns. Who it doesn't happen is for racialized and Black people, right? And so I have very little patience for centering the mental health of like white racists, because I don't think mental health struggles leads to racism, right? You might feel more aggravated, but it doesn't influence your philosophical political ideology in that way. That came from somewhere else in you. And I think, yeah, as much as it's important to collect that data and to center the mental health of folks who are entering our criminal justice system, I have very little patience for white perpetrators who use mental health and disability as a crutch to get away from their expression of racism and the harm that is caused to other people. That's not transformative justice. That's the system allowing white people to use any means necessary to continue to uphold racism. That might be a hot take, a little bit spicy, but that's all I'll say.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Some of the comments that we're also hearing and seeing are questions in the Q&A box. Thank you for those who are popping them in there. I see a couple of points around from Taslima Ahmed and Elham Bakri, bringing up the comment that was made yesterday by the Premier here in Ontario, that was really seen as denigrating towards immigrants. If you think you're coming to collect the dole and sit around, it's not going to happen. The idea of hardworking immigrants, and then sort of coupling it with another question around, do we see that some communities are more susceptible to racism or hate crime than others? And how do we develop a holistic approach? I'm bringing those two together because I think we all can perhaps speak to the influence of public rhetoric and discourse in the sort of the mainstream around us, and what's happening in the everyday to influence how people are treating one another and how systems continue to perpetuate oppression. So maybe I'll start with Selma now. Why is it so critical for politicians to be aware of the impact of their rhetoric and their words on communities, and how does that perpetuate some of the problems and issues that we've been identifying this morning?
I think there are a number of instances where we know that perpetrators of violence point to the comments made by political leaders in different levels of government as to really flaming the fuels of hatred and fear of the other, and that it is what led them to committing acts of violence. And so I think it is quite naive to say that, the words of politicians and people who are in the public sector and have these spheres of influence doesn't actually have an impact on the day-to-day. I think, the comments that were made by the Premier, it raises so many questions to me as to how it is we should respond to it. Obviously, it was racist and xenophobic thing to say, but I think we also have to be careful in our response as to not fall into the trap of then proving the worth of the people that come here who are racialized, and by saying, no, we are hard workers, no, we get degrees, no, we put in the time and the effort. And I think that's a very dangerous sort of narrative to fall into. It's very ableist and very classist, and puts immigrants into this box that I think is unnecessary, and like you're saying, ends up pitting people against one another in a way that is unhelpful. And I think instead of problematizing ourselves or our communities, or really saying, the issues are within us and the communities, I think instead the response should be problematizing the white supremacist society and the systems of oppression that looks at us as the issue. I think the response is building networks with one another by noticing and identifying that the source of our pain is the same. And only, I think, when we have that recognition and have that understanding can we really move forward as a society constructively.
Thank you so much for that. I wanted to open it up to the other panelists to respond to this question around the impacts that political rhetoric, as well as the events that we're seeing. So we've seen the pandemic. Certainly what we've noticed, those who are watching white supremacist groups and hate groups in this country, is almost the layering on of issues that these groups are, pushing forward and mobilizing, particularly online, and then spilling over into real life, where you've got the COVID conspiracies, you have the already existing Islamophobia and anti-Semitism of some of these groups, then we layered on further anti-Asian racism, and it just, and then the reaction to the George Floyd murder and the Black Lives Matter movement, you just kept layering on all these issues that certain hate groups in society that are, galvanizing online, and the online space as a whole, other major impact in terms of fueling and fanning those flames that Selma talked about. what does this mean for those of us working in these sectors, working with these vulnerable communities in terms of how we shine a spotlight on these impacts and what we need to do collectively to respond? I'll go to you, Amy.
First of all, I just want to thank Sarah for that reminder that white, racists would use that mental health card to get out of jail. It's a good reminder and made me feel less guilty about having that statement issued. But I just want to say that it is still something that I'm constantly learning. Thank you very much. So as you said, Amira, that throughout the pandemic, we have seen this influence of white supremacies that anti-immigrant, anti-racialized, anti-Islamic, groups, anti-everything that is so prevalent in our psyche, in the Canadian, society. And that's why having leadership, someone in leadership position to reinforce that is so much more dangerous. We know that it's out there. We know from all the social media tweets and postings and all that, but that it feeds into that. It really reinforces and feeds into that sentiment of hate. And that sentiment of, somebody call it nationalism, as one of our the participants said. Some people call it nativism, whatever, but not referring to Indigenous, So these white supremacists, these values, unfortunately permeate and have leadership like Trump, like, Derek Sloan calling Theresa Tam a Chinese, not being loyal. And in fact, Dr. Theresa Tam continued to be labeled as a Chinese spy. And, and we also have many examples of Bryan Adams, the pop culture type of, idol, calling out and in fact, making racist remarks. And immediately, we see overwhelming support for them in social media. We do. CCN-CSJ has received overwhelming attacks for speaking up against these leaders. I'm sure OCASI for speaking up against Doug Ford, our premier, received the same backlash immediately from people who agree and in fact amplify those voices. So you can imagine having that impact has to be pointed out, because lives are at risk here, right? That, Islamophobia has led to murders. That anti-Asian hate has led to physical assaults, and all that. So I think it is important, and Black lives, of course, have led to murders. So I think it is very important for us to notice that people who echo those voices are not only the white communities. At the same, that we know that white supremacy is supported by lots of these white, communities who feel that they are being threatened by these, onslaught of racialized people who are different from them and all that, right? Who have a different, quote unquote, belief systems and faith system and whatever, right? But we need to also recognize that amongst us, one of your participants pointed out, that these views are also shared by many immigrants, many newcomers, and including refugees from amongst us. And I have encountered, I have done, as I was talking to seniors online, talking about anti-Asian racism, racist remarks were made. It was a Mandarin speaking session, and racist remarks were made about, Indigenous, about Blacks. It's as if our suffering is not justified, but other people's suffering is justified. So I think while I don't want to, of course, dismiss the power differences here, the power hierarchy, the power that the white supremacists have over all of us here. But at the same time, let's also be willing to confront those views and those perceptions amongst us. So as immigrant settlement agencies, we really, really have to have, that understanding entrenched in all our programs and services when we try to work within an anti-racism, anti-oppression framework, that all our delivery has to come from that orientation. I have to say, in my consulting life, when I worked with agencies from the nonprofit world, I do see there is a bit of a lacking in that understanding amongst, some of the settlement and immigrant settlement agencies, and the understanding is not all there yet. And while, because in order to combat and change that power dynamics, right, we need all hands on deck. We need everybody to have that understanding that we need to arm everybody with that philosophy, with that framework of anti-oppression, anti-racism. And so I think it is important and incumbent on us as service providers to work with that, within that understanding.
Thank you so much for that, Amy. Absolutely. I was actually looking at a general social survey that was released by Statistics Canada last month, and there was a section on social identity for 2020 that showed that immigrant respondents, 63%, were more likely than Canadian-born respondents, 43%, to be proud of Canada's treatment of all groups in society. And for immigrants, pride in how Canada treats all groups in society is connected to the time since their arrival in Canada. So the longer they have been in Canada, you would actually see that their pride would decrease, the lower the pride in how Canada treats all groups in society, presumably, as reality sort of sets in and people start to interact with institutions and with other people, and they start to see, unfortunately, discriminatory treatment. So I wanted to turn it to Dr. Amal. How does this match with some of the work that you have been doing in communities in terms of that realization that the promise that Canada often holds for people coming here doesn't always hold true?
Absolutely. These findings really aligns with my research and the lived experiences of the Black Francophones. I recently wrote and published an article titled Reverse Inclusion, speaking to the trajectories of the Black Francophones in Canada. So basically, the more is not the merrier, but the more is the barrier. And I explained that, among the first generation, for instance, when we are in the phase of adaptation, this phase is the most successful. Inclusion should be increasing, but it is decreasing. So the first phase of immigration, again, adaptation, is the most successful. The second phase, more generally, settlement is less successful, because then we get into, additional barriers of lack of recognition of credentials or access to employment. Then when we get into the phase of integration or inclusion, of socio-economic, political, and identity inclusion, that is less successful, because, which takes us to what was said earlier, because in racialized minorities, in this case, Blacks, are perceived as being eternally newcomers, foreigners, not part of the nation nor genuine Canadians. My research also indicates that these trends occur within the first generation, but then the second generation faces is more excluded than the first generation. And the third, for instance, the second generation, here I'm alluding to my research among the Black Francophones in Alberta. My research among the Black Francophones in Quebec, for example, the Haitian, the third generation is even more excluded than the second generation, which is more excluded than the first generation. Trouble findings, which then, consequently decrease our sense of belongingness, again, identity to Canada, and confidence in Canada's ability to treat its racialized minorities, in this case, Black Francophones, equitably.
That's, I find that data and that research that you shared, Dr. Amal, it's really quite alarming, even for those of us who've worked in these spaces, but to really hear you lay out the case for, it almost goes against that popular cultural idea, even, that was implicit in the Premier's comments that, so long as you come and work hard, you will be welcomed and successful. But even that is not true from what you've seen generally across the country. I wonder if the other panels would also like to weigh in on that idea that, maybe we're actually, when it comes to settlement and the initial, welcoming of folks, yeah, things go well and all of those structures are in place and the work of OCASI and all the partners, that's happening. But where are things dropping off? Clearly, there's a major systemic failure. If you're seeing that the conditions are not necessarily improving, but in fact, getting worse for various minority communities, I wonder if other panels have comments on that. And what do we take away from that? What kind of advocacy is required to ensure that there are ways to address these discrepancies in outcomes for these various communities?
Well, the discrepancies exist because the whole purpose of immigration in the eyes of the state is to bring people in to do labor, right? It's built to make sure that some people will come in and do certain kinds of work and be exploited and be treated poorly. The immigration system was not built for people to actually come in and be treated equally and fairly. People are sold this meritocracy that doesn't exist, right? And so to answer that question, we'd have to completely restructure why and how people are allowed to immigrate in the first place. You need a lot of, you're either really, really, really at risk as an immigrant, or you're really, really wealthy and able to immigrate, right? And have capital where you came from. The system itself is not built to allow anybody who wants to come here and live equally. Because in theory, there are a lot of Canadians who are on social assistance too, who are here and not contributing certain kinds of labor, which is fine because a lot of Canadians are disabled and can't work. Not being able to work is fine. It's part of the human condition and we don't talk about it as such, but immigrants are not afforded the same privilege to not be allowed to work. Right? And so we need to really restructure this idea of who is valued. We value people based on their ability to do things, and we accept immigrants into the country in accordance to that Canadian value. But because we're not talking about that piece, it's really hard to talk about what are the gaps that exist once people get here.
Dr. Amal, did you want to weigh in on that? Because I saw you, kind of, responding, and you obviously have done some research. What are your thoughts on these really important points that Sarah is also raising?
Yeah, well, it is what I call, and I'm not the only one who call it, maybe others too, the glass ceiling in this case of anti-Black racism. Look at the number of newcomers, of Black newcomers who are happy with their first phase in Canada, and those who are happy with, eventually with their lives in Canada, people like myself and others, I would say there's a minority, like really a small, the middle class, Black middle class is a small, really, is very small compared again to the number of newcomers and number even of the second and third generation. So there is this white supremacy glass ceiling that should be dismantled. And to weigh this into my even a personal experience, I'm a first generation. I came as an adult to Canada. I was very happy, when I joined the University of Toronto, when I studied at the University of Toronto. I was really thrilled. Now there's my nephew, who is a second generation, recently was recently admitted into the University of Toronto. He's Canadian, he grew up in Canada. He is horrified to study at the AI University in Canada and then the university in Canada, and he keeps asking if, there is police at the university, or because we also, read about the racial profiling, especially of young Black men, now increasingly in universities, within universities such as the University of Canada. So it's deep-rooted anti-Black racism that then should be tackled by deep, also rooted structural radical transformation.
No, absolutely. We have another question from one of our participants, Margarita Cardona. She asks, what would be a positive alternative then to counteract, these racism, the anti-Black racism, anti-Asian, Islamophobia, all of these different forms of racism. The list is very long. If there isn't enough, budget funding or funding of addressing these, what is the government responsible in doing in addressing these issues? And I'm sure that the answer is multifaceted, but maybe as we get towards the conclusion, I'll open up to each of you, what role does government have? And for our sector here that we're talking to, the settlement sector, how can the settlement sector, ensure to, support and advance these policy objectives? So maybe Dr. Amal, you're on the screen, so we'll start with you, and then we'll go to Amy, Salma, and then Sarah.
At this point, I truly believe that the federal laws, Canadian laws that, impact, our daily lives, services, how we offer services, how we receive services, and who offers them and who receives them. The Canadian laws, federal laws are dated. They should be updated and modernized, to take into consideration all these important contemporary issues, systemic problems that this panel has highlighted. In my most recent book, which was published last month, I recommended that Black Canadians be considered a separate designated group. And this could also speak to other minorities, including racialized minorities, because as stated earlier, lumping us, so many groups into this one category of visible minorities doesn't, if it not only doesn't it help, it causes, additional problems. For example, again, in the case of Blacks being increasingly excluded. And I explain that, this will help, improve our status and plight, and because it will have repercussions for other policies that also guide our society and our practices and daily lives. For instance, the Official Languages Act, that it is being modernized, and I participated in the modernization consultations in Alberta, and we recommended that the act, which doesn't only mentions racism once, that it utilizes, explicitly recognizes racism and utilizes explicit Francophone racism, in this case, racism and anti-racism language. For instance, the charter or the laws, all Canadian laws, I believe they should be modernized. My briefly second example is the charter. You know that Article 23 of the charter guarantees Francophones, guarantees education in French to the Francophones. Article 15 prohibits racism, but what is lacking in all these laws is an intersection between anti-racism and the Francophonie. Because of this, lack of intersectionality, for instance, in the charter, there are, many, I would say, substantial educational resources that are given to the Francophones. Black Francophones are entirely excluded within the Francophone system. So point, revise, modernize the Canadian laws as we are working hard. We are fighting to use the conferences, uplifting terminology, fighting for a better future.
Thank you so much, Dr. Amal. Over to you, Amy, and we'll keep each of your final comments here short as we come up against the clock. Thank you.
Sure. So I want to also respond to one of the participants saying, what harm did Doug Ford do in terms of making that comment? And I think we can start with that within the organization, discuss that impact of a premier talking about that as part of the overall strategy of raising awareness about anti-oppression, anti-racism, and review within the organization, how do you advance that? What are the barriers that your organizations may have or may not have in terms of promoting and understanding and also in being more inclusive, more diverse, and truly, speak to the principles of anti-racism, and to be part of the OCASI, movement. OCASI is a strong advocate, and we need the people on the ground to share that data. We don't have government data, but OCASI membership has tremendous data because of who you work with. So how do we collect, analyze that data better to advance policy changes? I think OCASI family can really lead, in a way to use to take full use of that to help inform change systemically. So I truly believe each and every single one of this OCASI Immigrant Settlement Agency across, not only in Ontario, but across the country, can be part of that movement for change.
Selma, thank you, Amy. Selma, over to you.
Yeah, I think the push for change at all levels of leadership is definitely a necessary one. And I think sometimes we are told the myth that there isn't enough resources to go around necessarily, but I think it's really a matter of priorities and government priorities, really, of where they see fit these resources to be allocated. I think there, in terms of Islamophobia and what a number of civil liberty organizations have really been calling on the government to do is really set the tone, and not just with better rhetoric. Like we don't just not want to see harmful things being said about Muslims and about immigrants, but also there are actionable things that I think a number of organizations like NCCM have been calling on the government to be able to do and things that they can do, like, the Bill 21, having the Attorney General intervene in Quebec in the religious symbols law. How does institutionalized Islamophobia in that case send a message to Islamophobes and to white supremacists to say that Muslims have no place here in this country? And a lack of intervention from all levels of government, sends that message home and says that this sentiment is okay, and that Muslims, in fact, do not belong here. There's a responsibility, again, to set the tone and to intervene in organizations and civil servant organizations like the CRA and like CSIS. The CRA plenary has been coming up against allegations of their Islamophobic practices, for example. And so, you know, we have this responsibility from the federal government that organizations on the ground have been calling on the government to set the tone and to put in place and safeguard really our rights and the ability for Muslims to live and thrive in this country.
Thank you so much, Salma. We have a few extra minutes. So Sarah, over to you for some thoughts on this question around governments and their role and how the settlement agencies can help advance and push forward and be advocates of change.
I mean, the only other thing I'll add very quickly is, I'll talk slower, sorry. The only other thing I'll add very quickly is that settlement agencies should be working together to push against this golden cuff situation where a lot of groups are funded by the very governments that punish us for doing any sort of real advocacy, or whether it's implicit or explicitly stated, like there's certain kinds of advocacy you cannot do if you're going to push for certain levels of funding in order to support people on the ground. And so groups should begin working together to push against that and say, hey, if you really want to make structural changes, as elected people, you cannot be punishing us for pointing out what we're seeing as issues on the ground. I know for myself, we were told just for applying for a provincial grant that we need to go through our social media and make sure to delete anything that calls out government. And this is not even an DJNO is not even incorporated yet. We're just a grassroots group of people with disabilities pushing for change, right? And so if that's what we're experiencing, I can't imagine people who actually have charity status. That's one thing that I think people can work together on.
Wonderful. Well, you know, I think we've just heard such a wide variety of perspectives on this from each of you, and it really has you know, been enlightening for me. Definitely, I can speak for myself, even though, you know, some of us have been having these conversations for a long time without dating ourselves, but hopefully we're pushing the needle and we are seeing, you know, these conversations become more and more in the public discourse, though I will say it never seems to go far enough. And I think that's one of the messages from today, is that we really have such a long road ahead, and coming together will be so critical to continue to push for that. So I want to just, I'm going to pass the mic back to Debbie in a moment, but I wanted, as a moderator, just to thank the panelists for their insights, for preparing for today. We hope that the participants learned. I'm seeing the comments, still lots of many good questions and wonderful appreciation for today. And I know the conference will continue and there will be much more to explore. I want to also encourage folks to learn about all the different organizations represented here. You can see the speakers' bios and what organizations like Sarah's and everyone here are representing different organizations. Make sure to sign up for any newsletters that they may offer, learn about what they do, and participate where appropriate. And I will now pass it over to Debbie to close this session. And again, a hearty thank you to everyone. Merci beaucoup.
What a brilliant session. I am so waiting to hear what the comments in the feed loop was saying. I can see messages coming in that the audience, all 470 people plus on the call, was really enjoying it. Amira, thank you so much for being such an incredible moderator. Thank you to our panelists, to Selma, to Amy, to Sarah, to Amal. Amal, thank you especially for pivoting into English. Our deepest apologies to our Francophone colleagues. We are running into systems issues with our French interpretation channel. We are working on it. We're hoping it will be fixed by the end of lunch. Thank you for all of the issues that you surface, and for just the deep conversations around the intersections of these various identities and how it is that we need to move forward with all of the issues that have been surfaced here. Thank you for flagging that even within our sector, this work needs to be done. When we talk about issues of accessibility, we cannot speak about doing advocacy work without thinking about real systems change and how these discriminatory beliefs and behaviors has an impact on our various communities, racialized communities, or disability communities, minority faith communities, like Muslim communities. So thank you so much. I know our Francophone colleagues are so glad, Amal, that you have raised Francophone issues and centered it within this conversation. So thank you all. Thank you, Salma, again, Amy, Sarah, and Amal, and Amira. Thank you so much. Folks, please fill out your evaluation form. Take care of yourself. Have a great lunch, and we will see you back here at, I believe, at 1 p.m. Have a wonderful, wonderful day. What a great start to our conference. Dynamic panel. Thank you so much. Have a
And
good
thank you to you too, Debbie and OCASI.
Looking forward.
Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you.
Merci tout le monde.